talk about polyculture. You know, I'm going to say some introductory remarks, and then we'll find out, who else here starts doing, is doing it, which is probably many of you. I would say most people garden in polycultures, but less so do people farm in polycultures. And polyculture is obviously multiple plants within a system, but a polyculture also includes the microorganisms, the insects, the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, the microbiota that's associated with it that we don't normally see. So a polyculture is many types of life forms. I'm just plants to make it a lot easier. With maybe a brief reference to that, there's the other ones too. I recently got a book called The Scientific Basis for Intercropping in Indigenous Agriculture. Wow, was that a great book or not? Scientific Basis for Intercropping in Indigenous Agriculture. So it's most of the world today. The Western world goes to places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, where they have indigenous systems of agriculture they've developed over hundreds and thousands of years, and said, you're primitive and backward. You should farm with tractors and chemicals, and look at our great seeds that we have, and this is the modern path, and you don't want to be stuck back in the old days, so get with it. And we send missionaries, we send extension agents and scientists out there to help them change from their polycultures to monocultures, and that's progress. So these people did a study of the intercropping, which is it's always going to be a polyculture. It's always going to have at least two crops, and they looked at hundreds and hundreds of systems from around the world with facts and figures and production amounts, and they compared it to regular agriculture. Let's say simplistic, let's say soybeans and corn. If you have a field of corn, a field of soybeans, and then you take a field and make strips of corn, strips of soybean, and a strip of corn, and then some more soybean, that the yield of these polycultures in multiple systems almost always exceeded in a monoculture. And as a general rule, we might say that most of them fall in the 1.2 to 1.7 category. In other words, you get 1.7 times as much produce as if you're growing it in a monoculture, or 1.2 or 1.5. But some of the best ones would get over double. In other words, all of a sudden you're doubling the production by growing these things together. Now this is a rather simplistic analysis, usually of 2, 3, 4, 5 crops. They didn't really go into complex polycultures. They were relatively basic. And at the end of this study, they stated that one of the reasons for world hunger is monocultures. And the dominant paradigm is saying one of the reasons for hunger is that there's not enough people growing in big monocultures, industrial agriculture. We must have it to feed the world, or we'll all starve. And this book at the end said, the reason we have hunger in the world is because they're growing things in monocultures. And if we were doing all the world's monoculture crops in polycultures now, all of a sudden the world food production would really go up a lot. So, in other words, the reason for world hunger is monocultures, not the traditional systems. And as we know, most of the world's monocultures are all badly hammering the farmland and the ecosystems and the biodiversity, and it's just it's a big loss for the world. So the less industrial monoculture agriculture in the world, the better. And so how do we get the rest, how do we break that paradigm? I don't think we're going to fight it head on by legislating it out of existence, so I'd like to, but by the system collapsing. And I think that's probably what would be the path. Their fossil fuel machine with all their inputs, etc., being transferred all around the globe is just going to grind to a halt, and the industrial farmer will be sitting there with no gas and no parts and no chemical fertilizers, and we'll just have to close up shop.
Yeah.
So that's my prognosis. Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that part of an industrial farm is the factories that are required to produce the tractors.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Right. And they say, oh, it's so efficient. Yes. So, yeah. Pull up a piece of ground. There's mats in there as well. So I've come up with 4 types of polyculture today in my quick note taking. We'll see if anybody can think of other ones in these. But here's 4 basic polycultures. One is there are native polycultures that nature's put together on her own. And if you go to any place like the temperate rainforest here in this corner of Washington, you can find replicable guilds, we like to call them in permaculture, or communities of plants. Plant community is a better word, that you'll find over and over again in the landscape. You know, cedar with Doug fir, with alder, with trailing raspberry, and ocean spray, etc. There's, you know, we'll come up with plant communities that you'll find over and over across the landscape in the right habitat. The riparian zone, there'll be a dry zone, a rocky area, there'll be all these different, and so we can catalog all those plant communities, and they've done that for us for the most part. So anybody know where that list is? Where is the list of plant polycultures or plant communities native to Whatcom County? There's a question. I don't know the answer.
A book, a reference book?
There'll be reference books, and if for you real geeks, there's a man named Robert Daubenmeier, R. Daubenmeier, who did these plant community analyses for all the Columbia Basin and Northeast Washington, North Idaho, for all the forest communities and all the communities in the Columbia Basin. And because of his work, they're now starting to do that same work in other parts of the world. I don't know if they've applied his work to Whatcom County, but maybe. But if they have, there is our list. So we should find out, is there a Daubenmeier list for Whatcom County? Whatcom-Skagit. We might say northwest Washington. So I can ask some ecologists that. So there's that native list. And then humans have moved in and started lots of gardens and farms. And one of the places I go to seek inspiration is I go to the native polycultures and see what they're doing, and sort of say, oh, this likes to grow with this, and, you know, here's a list of these plants that like to grow together. There's a base. I can design a polyculture based on the native ones. You know, but in other words, if I have a degraded piece of land that's been clear cut and hasn't roared back, I can plant these. Another type is in towns, everybody's planted all these ornamental landscapes, very seldom useful, but ornamental landscapes, and they'll have a spruce tree with other things planted next to it, or a birch tree with things planted next to it and under it, and they weren't thinking like, oh, I'm going to design this nice polyculture. It's just like, oh, we want a birch tree and we want a bunch of pretty shrubs under it, and here's what's available at the nursery. But I can travel around town and tell you what, and I can learn from them. I could just make lists. I was showing a class one time at a permaculture course, this big spruce tree, and underneath it was like bare ground. There wasn't even grass growing. It was just like spruce needles and bare ground for the most part, because spruce is so allelopathic, so much chemicals in that drip line, and from the needles and from its root exudates, it's hard for almost anything else to grow under a spruce. And I said, look, this would be hard to do a polyculture for a spruce tree, blah, blah, blah. The same day I was walking in the neighborhood, and there was this big spruce tree that they had pruned up fairly ways, and it had rhododendrons and azaleas and some lilies of some kind, and they had planted all these ornamentals that were doing really nicely under the spruce tree. There was an example of a spruce guild. And so I could take that guild that was created there, and I could say, what? I don't really want to plant a rhododendron or an azalea maybe, but you know, blueberries and huckleberries are both ericaceous plants. They would probably do well there. So I can substitute, I can learn by looking at its relatives, and I can start looking at these city things, and that'll help me design things in my real life. So I look at those unintentional guilds. There's because humans have now brought all these plants into the neighborhood, blackberry is now a part of this guild. Here's what do we have here? We have goldenrod, alder, nitrogen fixing, blackberry, grasses, thimbleberry. What else do we see right in this little patch here? If we get down to the ground story level, we see trailing dewberry, the Pacific dewberry, and you know, it's a relatively simple system that we've got like maybe 7 noticeable components that we've named. So this is a functioning guild, but it's got native and non-native. Blackberry is the non-native in this case. Everything else is probably native.
What's with the fuzzy tops?
That's the goldenrod.
Huh.
And I collect those and sell them. I used to make $1,000 a year selling goldenrod seed, but that market fell apart. Now I don't have it anymore. But that was good money. I lived in Whatcom County at the time, and I knew where all the best goldenrod patches were. And I'd go out and make $1,000 in a week. Man, that was sweet. Oh.
What, the yellow flowers?
I collect the seed,
Oh, the seed.
and I just screen out from the seed heads the ripe seed, and I sell that to the native seed people. But that market ended, as far as I'm concerned. But it's also a great medicinal, and I harvest it for medicine too, and I sell it for medicine. So this is what David Holmgren calls a recombinant ecosystem. It's mostly dominantly native, but if you go into Bellingham, you'll find these wild areas that have native roses, hawthorn tree, the European hawthorns, blackberries, you know, any number of natives and non-natives living together in an ecosystem, and that is what David Holmgren calls a recombinant ecosystem. Native and native, no one planned it. It just sort of like they all just landed there, and they're working it out, and they're all living in that community.
Well, how do you tell what's like a healthy community and what's not?
Well, if it's growing and thriving, I would and looks healthy, I would call it a healthy. If it's like heavily polluted, and there's only things growing that could really stand the pollution, we might say that's. I don't know if I could really call it unhealthy, because it's still, you know, if all the plants there are sickly and look horrible, we definitely call it an unhealthy ecosystem, maybe.
Well, I guess I mean, like, to what extent is it really a good functioning polyculture? What if the blackberry's taking over most of it, or, you know, stuff like that?
Is there a survival of the fittest going on?
There is a survival of the fittest, but they're working it out, and some of the things will, over time, disappear from the community. New things will come in. It's not static. None of these communities are static. They're always evolving. As those alders get taller and produce more shade, the blackberries may just disappear in the understory because it's going to get too shady for them. The goldenrod probably would disappear too. The trailing dewberries would probably persist pretty well, and the thimbleberry. The grasses would tend to disappear. So over time, that community is going to change. As a permaculturist, I can come along and say, oh man, I'm just going to stick a few buckthorn in here, or you know, or maybe I'm going to put a few cascara in, or maybe I'll pick some things that I would like in the system that I can make money on, or that will give me some kind of production. Right now, what kind of production am I getting from the system? You know, there's a little bit of goldenrod to harvest. There's some blackberries to harvest. The alder catkins are a really useful medicine for candida. So there's a medicinal aspect to that. The bark's medicinal. The alder is a dye, and I could feed the leaves to livestock. So anyway, I have any number of uses for But I might say that, well, gee, I have a tree that will way outproduce that in terms of what it will give me, so I can replace some of them. But red alder is a great companion plant in our native polycultures. It's nitrogen fixing. Just a little story about agroforestry polycultures. There's a look at that. I brought my phone along so I could watch the time. We better turn it off for a minute. I'll have to call him back. For years, there was something called the, what we see, World Center for Agroforestry, and what was its old name? World Agroforestry Center. Oh, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. But there's the Center for Agroforestry in the world. That's where they first invented the term. The term's only been around since the mid-70s. About the same time permaculture came out is the same time that agroforestry as a word was invented. The concept was very old. And I wish they had a few more chairs here. We could
That's right, we're just
passing. You can always check it out for a little bit. I see a stool in here. There may be something else in there worth checking. So for years they've been now I'm moving into the agroforestry talk. For years they've been searching for the perfect nitrogen fixing tree to put in their agroforestry systems that wouldn't hurt the crop yield. Like they're always trying to fix nitrogen fixing trees with corn and other food crops for people in Africa, Latin America, etc. So agroforestry was invented for them, for people in the third world. At one point I was getting all of their yearbooks and I was studying their literature. I was really big on agroforestry, still am. And at one point in one of their yearbooks, this is like several decades down the line, they said, "Eureka, we found it. The perfect plant, the tree that's nitrogen fixing and the crop yield doesn't go down." So now this is it. We're just so excited. What was the plant? Alnus nepalensis, the Nepalese alder, which is sort of a subtropical kind of alder. But of course, here we have alder, one of the premier agroforestry nitrogen-fixing polyculture trees in the world. And they would chop them. They do a lot of chop and drop, as we call it in permaculture, where they keep lopping them off so they don't get too tall and make too much shade. But they would grow it in groves or interspersed with the other plantation to provide nitrogen, a bit of shade, a bit of cover, but also give lots of yield from the. In other words, they wanted they wanted the same or better food crop, but they also end up with the tree crop. That could be the 0.2 or the 0.3, because in most of these agroforestry polycultures, the nitrogen-fixing trees or the shrubs, in many cases, not always nitrogen-fixing, are fodder for animals, produce nuts, produce fruits, produce fodder, produce compost, produce mulch, produce fibers, produce dyes, produce all these other products. So in an ideal, this is a bit humanistic, ideal permaculture, everything in the system has a productive use and or a functional use. In other words, it serves a function. It could be windbreak, pollinator habitat, predator habitat. It doesn't necessarily have to give you something, as long as it's doing something useful for the overall community. So back to those different types of permaculture, intentional polycultures are designed by indigenous people around the world and by permaculturists and by polyculturists. And what do we mean? People that deliberately try to grow things in groups. So does that make sense? Permaculture, polyculture. And permaculturists, I would say, are some of the world's premier polyculturists. I mean, a really good permaculturist. There's a lot of different kinds of permaculturists. You could, Some of them are really experienced and top of the line and brilliant people, and other ones are kind of, they're just getting going. They haven't learned too much yet, and they're, so there's a lot of different levels, and truth be told, there's also ones that are more eloquent. There's people that are very great permaculturists but not very eloquent, and then there's eloquent people that aren't very good permaculturists. Ooh, those are the most dangerous ones. The best ones are the eloquent and good permaculturists. They're good, really good at it, and they're eloquent. So permaculture is a good permaculturist studies indigenous agriculture around the world. In other words, permaculture is you might say, in a sense, a repository or a melting pot for indigenous agriculture systems from all around the world. Because as a permaculturist, when I'm studying my books, I'm going to classes or courses or watching YouTubes or whatever, I'm learning about the ancient Zuni systems. I'm learning about Amazonian systems. I'm learning about systems in Nepal, from the Maori people, from India, from Kenya, etc., etc., etc. And I really do study these systems. And permaculture takes those ideas that they've learned from all these indigenous peoples and starts mixing them up. And we're also a translator between indigenous cultures. I can go to Nepal and tell them about a Hawaiian system, or tell them about a system from Bolivia. That will be useful to them. It's like, hey, look, this is what traditional peoples did there. You can learn from them. So in a sense, we're a conduit for traditional information between peoples. It's sort of a hidden side of permaculture that doesn't get really, I don't think, brought out that much. So permaculture learns a lot from studying other polycultures and learning from other people's systems. And when I was in Belize teaching a permaculture course one time, and we had these Mayan people come there, and they were teaching us thatching, and they took us out to their, Allelopathy in particular was this guy, he's trying to keep alive the traditional Mayan way of agriculture. This is a lot of Mayan hill farming. They do what they call milpas, which is they slash a bit of rainforest, grow corn and beans and rice for a few years, and then the soil fertility tends to go away. They let it grow back up into early stages of succession, rebuild the soil, cut it down again, and so they're doing slash and burn, or swidden farming. Allelopathy was trying to keep this tradition alive. In the midst of corn varieties coming in from the U.S., chemical inputs coming in, they were starting to lose their traditional systems. And he was trying to keep that alive. And so we allied ourselves with him as a permaculturist, and he taught us things that he knew from traditional Mayan stuff, and we taught him things we knew in permaculture, and it was a beautiful match. Both of us improved by knowing of each other's stuff. And so we were supporting his indigenous information and saying how good it was, whereas most of the Western experts are saying, oh, that's, you don't want to do that anymore. And we're saying, yes, that's really good. So there's, and so one of the things that we changed with Allelopathy, I'm not sure what was just us, but at any rate, instead of slash and burn, he was doing slash and mulch. You cut down that stuff, but you just let it mulch and decompose on the ground instead of burning it. So you get a lot more. You keep the nutrients in the system longer, you help the soil biota, so you're just helping the system. Slash and burn has its place. When you do a slash and burn, if you ever looked at photos of a slash and burn system at the end, and you see the farmers out there, they usually have long digging sticks, and they're chopping little holes in the ground and throwing some seeds in and covering up with their foot, and they go down over here and poke another hole. You'll see this in New Guinea. You'll see this in Maya land. You'll see this in cultures around the world. People going into this black charred landscape that they just burned and poking these seeds in. And you realize when you look at this, you say, man, it's a lot of biochar they just created. Because there's a lot of this charcoal stuff. So in other words, it's a biochar-based system. What's all the rage these days? Biochar. These people have been doing biochar for millennia. And as a result, their soils have a lot of carbon sequestration, a lot of charcoal in there, and so they have a lot of biochar in their agricultural landscapes, and nobody even knew it till today. I bet the slash and burn people I'm not even sure they're still aware of that dynamic going on. So I just realized it myself. I'm just like, oh, a lot of charcoal being created. So we might say, oh, that's bad, slash and burn, but it has good components as well. So how do we keep the best and improve on it? How many people here garden or farm or grow stuff? Yeah, most of us. And how many have plants in polycultures are growing next to each other? Yeah, it's hard to be, we're so poor it's hard to have a monoculture. You need to have a big land, it's like you need at least an acre. I don't know if I could call it a monoculture unless you had like I don't know, maybe a quarter acre might be a monoculture. Where's the limit? Huh?
I don't have a rototiller. So.
Right, it's hard to do it. So we're all doing polycultures, and so we learn companion planting is a form of polyculture. It's the old style. You can buy books on companion planting. What's that? It's all about growing things in polycultures. It's just that companion planting sounded a lot less intimidating than a polyculture. It's just growing things with their companions. And so that's the art, is which things to grow next to each other so that everybody benefits. You know what? It's hard to do. A lot of times something gains and something loses. Like, oh, that plant didn't do so good. I mean, it got overwhelmed by that giant brassica next door or whatever it was. So you gradually learn your plant spacings. How close can you put things? And in a good, I had a friend, in a good polyculture, you get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know. It depends on if you have an area this big. In a garden, a lot of people might have 20, 30, 40 things you're growing. It'd be interesting in a polyculture, to me, I guess, is where canopies overlap and interact, and root systems overlap and interact. So in a system like this, you've got the red alder roots down there, the blackberry, all of these plants in this little system here all have their roots running around the ground together. It isn't like, this is my root area and I have defended it from everything else. Heck no. Their root systems are intermingling down there and running around together. And then there's all the mycorrhizal fungi that are under the ground, which link interspecies sometimes. Not always, but some things are linked interspecies. So they can be linked underground by the mycorrhizal network under there. And of course there's the whole microbe network, etc. So it's a lot easier sometimes to get roots to interact nicely versus the canopy, the overstory, the leaves. But in my gardens, I have this plant here and this row of plants here, and they all start growing together, and then you end up with this, like, part of the canopy is one species and parts another, and then there's another one coming from the side. And so you have, in a small distance, you can have all these different leaf areas. And of course, in complex agroforestry polycultures, you have an overstory, a middle story, an understory. You can have all these different levels, and it can be very complex. And this here has easily 3 levels: over, middle, and under story here. It's not very complex. But you go out here where you have a forest that's 100 feet tall, now all of a sudden it starts getting really complex. And so how do you get all those canopies to work together, or you might say, so that the dominant ones can let other things live underneath them? It's sort of like, how do humans learn to have dominant members of the society not negatively impact the less dominant people? Right now we have some people that are just really running roughshod over a lot of people.
They get what they need. They get what they need so that they don't need to.
Right, everybody gets what they need, but there's still room. You don't crowd everybody out around you. A lot of plants use what they call allelopathy, which is chemical warfare. They exude, mostly through their roots, things that inhibit. They try to hold their own space, and try to keep other roots out of it. And so they use chemical warfare. A really good one in case in point is peppermint. The mints are very often very allelopathic. Cedar is a great example from our forest here. Cedar really, you might say, poisons the ground for a lot of other plants around it. Only certain things can grow in that right next to the cedar or that spruce. So plants that have allelopathic make it, they may be harder to fit into a system. Black walnut is a famous example of an allelopathic. Everybody knows that walnut puts a lot of things in the ground that makes it hard for other things to grow. They're juglone, etc. Part of that's leaf litter, and things and leaf exudates dropping from the sky. Part of it's root exudates from the ground. Different pathways.
You want to use that as mulch in your garden.
You can, but there'd be certain things that it would be. Let's say pine needles are allelopathic, but it's great for strawberries or for raspberries. There's certain things that like, or blueberries. There's things that really like the acidity, and it's going to be useful for them. So it's just knowing the acidity even, or the pH of your different mulch materials, or how do you use, like one of the things that's hardest for me to use in the system is sunflowers. Sunflowers are really allelopathic. And you grow sunflowers, and that includes drusen artichokes in an area, there's a lot of things that won't grow good the next year. And I knew that sunflowers are that way, but one year I get big drusen artichoke patch or border, and the next year I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to plant potatoes this year. I had a miserable potato yield. It was just like, God, these potatoes are pathetic.
Is it because they extract a lot from the soil? Is that why?
No, it's because the drusen artichokes had put so much of this allelopathic stuff in the soil that the potatoes didn't do very well. So the allelopathy extended into the second year. Or I don't know, some things it takes years to break it all down. And so I learned that drusen artichokes is hard to follow after because, probably for a lot of things.
Is there something that could follow it?
Yeah, here's my plan for next time if I do it is, I've got drusen artichokes this year. It's like, I might put I think that putting a bunch of biochar in the soil might sop a lot of that up. But I'm also thinking of like, I'm going to grow a squash row out here, 6 feet away or whatever, out beyond the root zone of this, and then let the squash cover it all up over the ground. They don't need to use that root area so much, so to speak, but I can still get a crop there. Well, that year the allelopathic substances are breaking down, so I imagine after 1 year of breakdown it'll be a lot less effect. But see, who's studying that? Who's studying the allelopathic effect of sunflowers and drusen artichokes, and how long that effect lasts, and how do you mitigate it? Anybody working on that? But it's somebody can make it. It's nice work, or at least one little part.
Jerusalem artichoke.
Okay, work of what would be good afterwards.
They come up just fine year after year.
Oh yeah, but you know what? But they tend to get the diseases and insects tend to build up. And unless you thin them really good, then they're just too thick. You have to to get really big tubers, you need about that much space per plant. And if you got 20 trying to live there, they all have little tiny, dinky little tubers, and they just don't produce that well. That's my experience. So but if you thin them, I actually do grow it 2 or 3 years in a row too. But I really thin the heck. What I do is I harvest them all. But I always deliberately leave some in there. It's hard not to.
You can't get them all out.
You would have to work really hard. Yeah. But I deliberately make sure that there's enough in there. And then I transplant them too. I can take those new starts in the spring and move them where I want, instead of saving them in the root cellar, which is always problematical. Yeah. So is anybody studying polycultures here, like in a deliberate way? I'm just curious if they're, like Heather.
I'm studying permaculture.
Yeah. Well, then that's it. And what's your name?
I'm Danny.
Danny. Right. Where's your place?
I wish I had a property. I live in an apartment at the time. Feel like
right.
I'm
So you're studying it, and the practice is next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Heather, what's your situation?
Everywhere I walk.
Everywhere you walk.
Everywhere I walk, and then I care for land out beyond, and then I learn from people that know way more than me. So I, come going to new gardens and also going to old ones, like the new ones is one way, and then the old gardens, a lot of times it's what you got to pull out, learning about those aggressive ones. And I also have my permaculture design certificate, and just a plug, I think Skeeter's offering something coming up soon, so I encourage anybody, if you ever consider doing it, it's totally a life course.
Yay, permaculture.
Hey Skeeter,
So,
I
yeah.
I would bunch like food forest into a polyculture system. And
Definitely.
that's what I'm really interested in, is creating food forest and mimicking. And I think I might have got this from you because I just heard you say this, and you were one of my kind of original permaculture people a long time ago. The looking at nature and then replacing those things that nature has already done perfectly with something that it's more useful to you, you know, that's in the same. I mean, a perfect example that I love to replace is like the native elderberry, sambucus, with like the black elderberry, which I use a lot more than. So, I don't know, that's a huge polyculture system that I consider.
Yeah, and the whole food forest movement is, you know, heavily informed and integrated with permaculture.
Sure.
It's beyond just permaculture people, but permacultures really cover that. So food forests, and there's more and more books about that, of course. And there's also forest gardens is another term, food forests, forest gardens. I put together what I call medicinal food forests. And I used to put together medicinal forests. But it's hard to put together a medicinal forest without having a medicinal food forest.
Right.
But I want my forest systems to have a lot of food and a lot of medicine.
Yeah.
But you can go either way. But it's almost
Both.
impossible not to have both.
Right.
Because so many fruits are medicinal. Elderberries and hawthorns. In fact, we could say that all fruits are medicinal. I think berries. I once gave a talk to a group, and I said, most of society says here's food, and then here's medicinal plants. But there's this whole big area in between where there's food, and then there's medicine that's pretty much only used for. But there's a whole big section in the middle that's food, but it's also used for medicine. So it has, and I was like, food and medicine, and all the culinary herbs, for example, almost all the berries, blah blah blah. It goes on and on and on. But here's the ones that are just the food. And afterwards, this German lady came, or actually she did it during the workshop. Or no, she said afterwards. She said, you got it wrong, mister. She said, all foods are medicinal. All foods are medicinal. I had to go like, oh, ma'am, I guess you have a point. All foods are medicinal, but some are, really thought more as medicinal. But so there's that blurring there. So food, medicinal food forest is, medicinal food forest is something I'm excited. And I can't remember your name.
Rebby.
Rebby. And we met. Anybody else want to mention what they're working on polycultures?
We're moving on to a large property this spring, so we're just cultivating ideas now.
All right. How big a property?
5
acres.
5 acres.
A lot.
Yeah.
And is it open or forested or partly? What's there now?
It's being hayed right now.
It's all a hayfield. Well, that's pretty simplistic. Of course, and then you could identify what species are in that hay, and how are you going to change it over to these these great polyculture systems with all these canopies. Yeah, well, that's exciting. Lots to learn there. You can till it up and plant things, or what they do in Hawaii when they have these they have these giant grasses there. They're like 10 to 20 feet tall. I mean, we're talking massive grasses with giant rhizomes, and it's hard to get a shovel in the ground. It's such a thick mass down there. Yeah. So they hay it, or cut it all up, and then they roll it into the giant bales. Then they take one of the bales and they unroll it on the contour across the hayfield, and then mulch out all that stuff underneath it, and then plant a row of trees, in that long row. Of course, the rest of it's still going to be grass, etc., and they can cut it again. But over time, they're using the grass itself to prepare the ground for the tree planting. That trees would otherwise have a very tough time surviving in it. So using part of the biomass to mulch part of the new system.
Nice.